I never thought I'd be sitting across from my only son, watching his face contort with rage as I slid the papers back across the polished oak table of Westfield Notary Services. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across his handsome face, the face that looked so much like his father's. It still made my heart ache after all these years. "Mom, what are you doing?" Michael's voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fury simmering underneath. The notary, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a practical bob, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "It's just a formality. We talked about this." "Did we?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. At 65, I'd spent decades building a life with Richard, my late husband. 43 years of marriage, raising our son, building our printing business from nothing into something worth having. Now, 15 months after burying Richard, here I was, being asked to sign away everything we'd built. I looked down at the document again, at the small print on the last page that Michael hadn't expected me to read. The clause that would transfer full ownership of our family home, not into a trust as he'd claimed, but directly to him with immediate occupancy rights. The document that would make me, essentially, a tenant in my own home, the home I'd paid off with Richard 20 years ago. I think Mrs. Harrison might need more time to review these documents. The notary, Miss Patel, according to her nameplate, suggested diplomatically. Michael's jaw tightened. "There's no need. We've been over everything." He turned to me. His blue eyes, Richard's eyes, narrowed slightly. "Mom, remember what Dr. Winters said about your memory? We discussed all this last week. The trust, the house, everything." Dr. Winters. My supposed cognitive assessment that Michael had arranged. The doctor who spent 20 minutes with me before suggesting I might be showing early signs of cognitive decline. The assessment Michael had repeatedly referenced whenever I questioned his decisions about my finances over the past 3 months. "I remember everything perfectly, Michael." I gathered my purse, feeling the weight of my cell phone inside, the phone where I'd recorded our last 3 conversations on the advice of my neighbor Diane, who'd seen too many of her friends railroaded by well-meaning or not so well-meaning children. And I remember that we never discussed transferring the deed directly to you. We talked about a family trust, with both of us as trustees. The flush that crept up his neck told me everything. This wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. This was calculated. My son, the boy I'd nursed through chickenpox, taught to ride a bike, helped through college, was trying to take my home from under me. "Mrs. Harrison," Miss Patel said gently, "would you like me to reschedule this appointment?" "That won't be necessary." I stood up, smoothing down my navy dress, the one Richard always said made my eyes look young. "I won't be signing these particular documents, ever." Michael stood too, towering over me at 6'2". When had my little boy grown so tall, so cold? "Mom, you're being ridiculous. This is for your own protection." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "Then why does the document state that I would need your written permission to sell or refinance? Why does it give you the right to evict any unauthorized occupants, which would include my sister if she came to stay with me? Why does paragraph 6 give you control over the business accounts as well?" His face went from flushed to pale in an instant. "You're confused. That's not—" "I ran a business for 40 years. Michael, I know how to read a contract." I turned to the notary. "Thank you for your time, Miss Patel." As I walked out into the crisp October air, I heard Michael's hurried footsteps behind me. His hand caught my elbow, not rough but insistent. "Mom, wait. You don't understand what you're doing." I gently removed his hand. "I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is when my son decided that taking advantage of his widowed mother was acceptable. It's not like that." His voice dropped, became placating. "Look, Sandra's father helped with these documents. He's just being thorough, making sure everything's protected. Sandra, my daughter-in-law of 3 years. The corporate attorney whose father happened to be a real estate lawyer specializing in estate transfers and probate avoidance. The woman who'd been subtly suggesting I was becoming forgetful since Richard's funeral. Tell Sandra and her father I appreciate their concern, I said, reaching for my car keys. But I'll be consulting my own attorney from now on. The look that flashed across his face, frustration mixed with something harder, calculating, sent a chill through me despite the warm fall day. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the opening move in a game I hadn't realized we were playing. As I drove home to the colonial-style house on Maple Street where I'd lived for the past 35 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's diagnosis: clarity. The fog of grief that had enveloped me since his death from pancreatic cancer was burning away, replaced by a cold, crystalline understanding. My son was trying to take everything from me, and I would have to fight him. The house looked the same as it always did, white with black shutters, the maple tree in the front yard turning brilliant orange, Richard's carefully maintained garden beds now tended by my own hands. But it felt different knowing my son had been planning to claim it as his own. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, Richard's favorite, and sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals. The same table where 3 months ago, Michael and Sandra had gently suggested I might need help managing my finances after they'd noticed a few duplicate bill payments in my checkbook. The help had started small, Michael adding himself to my checking account to keep an eye on things, suggesting I give Sandra online access to my credit card accounts so she could watch for fraud. Small things that had seemed reasonable when suggested by my concerned son, as I was still lost in grief. But then came the suggestions that I sell the business property instead of continuing to lease it out, the concerns about my driving, the doctor's appointment that Michael had arranged and attended with me, the casual comments about how the 3-bedroom house was too much for one person and how they were worried about those stairs. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew I could trust. Helen, it's Patricia. I need your help. Helen Shaw had been my best friend since college. A retired family law attorney who'd seen more inheritance disputes than anyone should have to witness. She'd been gently warning me about Michael's increasing involvement in my finances. I hadn't wanted to listen. Now I wished I had. What happened? Her voice was instantly alert. Michael tried to get me to sign over the house to him today, not into a trust, directly to him. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't talk to him again until we've met. As I waited for Helen, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I went into Richard's office, sat at his desk, and opened his meticulous files. My husband had been the organized one in our partnership, both in business and in marriage. I'd been the creative force, the one who built client relationships and designed campaigns, while Richard managed the books and kept everything running smoothly. After his diagnosis, he'd created a folder labeled "For Patricia" with everything I would need: account numbers, passwords, contact information for our accountant and attorney, insurance policies. I'd glanced at it after the funeral but had been too overwhelmed to process it all. Now I read every page, the familiar sight of Richard's precise handwriting bringing both comfort and fresh grief. By the time Helen's car pulled into the driveway, I had a much clearer picture of our financial situation and of what Michael stood to gain by taking control. The business property alone was worth over $800,000. The house, in this desirable Boston suburb, easily $1.2 million. Richard's life insurance had paid out $500,000, most of which was still sitting in our joint investment account, the one Michael had recently suggested we consolidate with the new accounts he'd set up. All told, nearly $2.5 million in assets that Michael and Sandra had been systematically trying to maneuver under their control. Helen didn't bother with pleasantries when I opened the door. Tall, silver-haired, and formidable in a tailored pantsuit, she stepped inside and fixed me with her penetrating gaze. "Tell me everything. Start with when Richard died and don't leave anything out." For the next hour, I laid it all out. The subtle suggestions, the doctor's appointment, the gradual insertion of Michael and Sandra into every aspect of my finances, culminating in today's attempted property transfer. Helen took notes in her precise lawyer's shorthand, occasionally asking for clarification or specific dates. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me steadily. "You realize this is elder financial abuse," she said. Not a question, but a statement. The words hit me like a physical blow. "He's my son." "Yes, and he's attempting to defraud you of your home and assets." Her tone softened slightly. "Patricia, I've seen this hundreds of times. The people who exploit the elderly aren't usually strangers." My voice small. Helen's expression was grim but determined. "First, we secure your assets. Tomorrow morning, we're going to your bank and investment firm to remove Michael's access. We'll set up new accounts if necessary. Then we're calling Edward Reynolds. Edward was Richard's longtime attorney. We need to create a proper estate plan that protects you, possibly including a trust, but one that you control. And Michael?" Her eyes softened. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? He's still your son. You can confront him, set boundaries, even give him a chance to explain. But Patricia," she leaned forward, her expression deadly serious, "don't fool yourself. What happened today wasn't a misunderstanding. It was attempted theft from his own mother." After Helen left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness of my living room, surrounded by the life Richard and I had built together. The wedding photo on the mantel, the sofa we'd picked out during our 25th anniversary year, the watercolor from our trip to Maine for our 40th. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened today. You're making a big mistake. I'm just trying to help." I set the phone down without responding. Tomorrow would be soon enough to begin the battle. Tonight was for grief, not just for Richard, but for the son I thought I knew. The next morning dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect New England autumn days that Richard had loved so much. I dressed carefully in a burgundy pantsuit that Sandra had once commented made me look matronly, a small act of defiance that gave me more satisfaction than it probably should have. Helen arrived at 8 sharp, dressed for battle in charcoal gray, with a leather briefcase that had seen many courtroom victories. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," I replied, locking my front door with a new sense of protectiveness. This was my home, mine and Richard's, and I would fight to keep it. Our first stop was First National Bank, where Michael and I had added our joint account 3 months earlier. The bank manager, Mr. Delaney, was initially resistant when I asked to remove Michael's name. "Mrs. Harrison, these joint accounts are set up specifically to be accessible by both parties. Removing access typically requires both signatures." Helen stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Delaney, are you familiar with the Elder Justice Act and Massachusetts's Elder Financial Abuse statutes? My client is removing her son's access due to documented attempts to misappropriate her assets. Would you prefer to facilitate this protective measure, or should we escalate this to your legal department with a formal complaint?" Mr. Delaney's expression changed quickly. 20 minutes and several signed documents later, I had a new account solely in my name, and my funds had been transferred. "That went well," I said as we walked back to Helen's car. Helen's expression was grimly satisfied. Banks don't want to be implicated in elder abuse cases. Once you use the magic words, they tend to cooperate. Our next stop was Fidelity Investments, where the process repeated with my retirement and investment accounts. By noon, Every financial account I owned was secured from Michael's access, with new passwords and security questions he couldn't possibly guess. We'd also placed alerts on my credit report to prevent any new accounts from being opened in my name. Over lunch at a quiet cafe, Helen outlined our next steps. Edward Reynolds can see us at 3 o'clock. Before that, I think we should stop by your business property. When was the last time you were there? I paused, realizing with a jolt that I hadn't visited the property since leasing it to a marketing firm 6 months ago, shortly after Richard's death, when Michael had suggested that handling tenant issues would be too stressful for me. Too long, I admitted. But Michael has been collecting the rent checks and depositing them. Even as I said it, I realized I'd never actually verified those deposits. Helen's raised eyebrow told me she'd had the same thought. Let's go see your property, Patricia. Harrison Printing had occupied the 5,000 square foot commercial building near Davis Square for 30 years before Richard and I retired 5 years ago. We'd initially leased it to a small publishing company, and then, after they relocated, to Apex Marketing last year. The lease, managed through Wilson Property Management, was supposed to generate $8,500 monthly. As we pulled into the parking lot, I was surprised to see the Apex Marketing sign was gone, replaced by Nexus Tech Solutions. A row of sleek cars lined the parking spots. This doesn't look right, I murmured as we walked toward the entrance. Inside, the reception area had been completely remodeled. Modern furnishings, glass partitions, a far cry from the comfortable but modest setup that Apex had maintained. A young receptionist looked up from her computer. "Welcome to Nexus Tech. Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, finding my voice. "I'm Patricia Harrison. I own this building." Her perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, you'll want to speak with Mr. Donovan then." "One moment." She picked up her phone and murmured something I couldn't catch. A moment later, a man in his 40s with an expensive haircut and an even more expensive suit emerged from a hallway. "Mrs. Harrison, this is unexpected. I'm James Donovan, CEO of Nexus Tech. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Mr. Donovan?" I shook his extended hand. "I'm a bit confused. I thought Apex Marketing was leasing this space." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Apex? No, we've been here for nearly 4 months now. We leased directly from Harrison Holdings, LLC. Your company, I presumed." Ice formed in my stomach. I'd never heard of Harrison Holdings, LLC. Helen stepped forward smoothly. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Helen Shaw, Mrs. Harrison's attorney. Would you mind sharing the details of your lease agreement?" "Not at all," he said, though his friendly expression had become more guarded. "Though I primarily dealt with Michael Harrison. He's the managing partner of Harrison Holdings, according to our contract." 20 minutes and several uncomfortable revelations later, Helen and I sat in her car, staring at the copy of the lease agreement James Donovan had provided. The document showed that Nexus Tech Solutions was paying $12,500 monthly to Harrison Holdings, LLC, a company Michael had apparently formed without my knowledge. The lease had been signed 4 months ago, which meant that for 4 months, Michael had been collecting $12,500 per month that I'd never seen. $50,000, I said numbly. "He's stolen at least $50,000 and I never even knew." Helen's expression was thunderous. "This goes well beyond what I expected, Patricia. This isn't opportunistic exploitation. This is calculated fraud. We need to call Edward now, and after that, potentially the district attorney." "The police? But he's my son, who has stolen $50,000 from you and attempted to steal property worth millions more." Helen's voice was gentle but firm. "I understand he's your son, and that makes this heartbreaking. But what he's done is criminal." As we drove to Edward Reynolds' office, my mind reeled with the implications. Michael hadn't just tried to take advantage of my supposed cognitive decline. He'd created a fictitious company, diverted significant income, and attempted to defraud me of my most valuable assets. And all while looking me in the eye every Sunday dinner, asking about my week, bringing his children, my grandchildren, to visit their forgetful grandmother. Edward Reynolds's law office occupied the top floor of a renovated mill building in downtown Boston. At 72, he could have retired years ago, but as he often told Richard, golf bores me to tears, and my wife says if I'm home all day, one of us won't survive. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp behind steel-rimmed glasses as he ushered us into his wood-paneled office. Patricia, it's been too long. Richard would haunt me if he knew I'd let you go without proper legal counsel for over a year. Richard would be haunting someone else right now, I said grimly as I took a seat. For the next hour, we laid out everything: the attempted property transfer, the discovery of Harrison Holdings, the diverted lease payments. Edward took notes in his precise handwriting, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly listening with a deepening frown. When we finished, he set down his pen and removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. In 45 years of practice, I've seen many family disputes over money, but this level of calculated deception from his son. He shook his head. Patricia, I need to be very clear. What Michael has done constitutes multiple felonies: wire fraud, elder financial abuse, possibly identity theft if he formed Harrison Holdings using your information without authorization. What are my options? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Edward leaned back in his chair, considering. We have several paths. First and most urgent is securing your assets and estate, which you've already begun. I'll draw up a revocable trust today with you as sole trustee and beneficiary. We'll transfer the house and business property into it immediately. And regarding Michael's actions, Edward and Helen exchanged glances. You have 3 main options, Edward said carefully. 1. Full criminal prosecution. We contact the district attorney with evidence of fraud and financial abuse. Michael would likely face criminal charges, possibly prison time. The thought of my son in prison made my stomach turn, but I nodded for him to continue. 2. Civil litigation. We sue Michael for the misappropriated funds and any damages. Less severe than criminal charges, but still a formal legal proceeding that would become public record. And the third option? I asked. A private family resolution. We confront Michael with evidence of what we've discovered and demand full restitution, plus additional compensation. We draft a legally binding agreement that protects you going forward. If he refuses or violates the agreement, we proceed to options 1 or 2. That's assuming he's willing to make restitution, Helen pointed out. Edward nodded. Indeed. This option only works if Michael acknowledges his wrongdoing and is willing to make amends, financially at least. It won't repair the breach of trust, but it might avoid dragging family matters through the courts. I need time to think, I said, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders. Of course, Edward said gently. But Patricia, whatever you decide about Michael, we need to secure your assets immediately. I'm going to have my team draw up a revocable living trust today. We'll transfer your properties into it with you as the trustee and beneficiary. This will protect you regardless of how you decide to handle Michael's actions. By the time I returned home that evening, my head was spinning with legal terms and financial maneuvers. Edward had moved with remarkable efficiency. I'd signed preliminary paperwork to create the Patricia A. Harrison Living Trust, and he'd begun the process of transferring my properties into it. Helen had helped me contact Wilson Property Management to inform them of the fraudulent Harrison Holdings situation and redirect future communications to me directly. As I walked up my front path in the fading light, I noticed Michael's black BMW parked across the street. My heart sank. I wasn't ready for this confrontation, not tonight, not with everything still so raw. But as I reached for my door key, he emerged from his car and strode towards me, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Mom," he called, "we need to talk." "The bank called me. What the hell do you think you're doing?" I turned to face him, suddenly aware that this tall, angry man was a stranger wearing my son's face. "I'm protecting myself, Michael. Something I should have done months ago." "Protecting yourself?" He gave a harsh laugh. "From what? From your only son who's been managing everything while you've been too grief-stricken to function? Who's been making sure your bills are paid and your investments are handled? This is how you thank me." "Thank you," I repeated, my voice rising. "Should I thank you for creating Harrison Holdings to steal my rental income? For trying to trick me into signing away my home? For telling everyone I'm losing my mind when my only problem was trusting you?" His face went white, then red. For a moment he looked so much like Richard when he'd been caught in a lie that my heart twisted painfully. "Who's been filling your head with these ideas? That interfering friend of yours, Helen? Mom, you're confused." "Stop it," I snapped, anger flaring hot and bright. "I've seen the Nexus Tech lease." "Michael, I know you've been collecting $12,500 a month for 4 months without a penny coming to me. That's theft. That's fraud. That's a felony." He took a step back, calculation replacing indignation in his eyes. "It's not what you think. I was consolidating everything, making it easier to manage, too. That money was going into investments for your benefit." "Save it for the district attorney," I said coldly, fishing my house key from my purse. "You'd press charges against your own son?" His voice held disbelief, but something else too, fear. "I haven't decided yet, but right now, I want you to leave." "Don't call me. Don't text me. My attorney will contact you when I'm ready to discuss restitution." "Restitution? Mom, you're overreacting. Let's sit down and talk about this like family." "Family doesn't steal from family," I said, turning my back on him and inserting my key in the lock. "And until you acknowledge what you've done and make it right, we have nothing to discuss." I stepped inside and closed the door on his protests, leaning against it as my knees threatened to give way. Through the door, I heard him call out once more, "Mom, please!" before the sound of his retreating footsteps and car doors slamming reached me. Only then did I allow the tears to come, for Richard, who wasn't here to help me through this, for the son I thought I'd raised better, for the family that now lay in fragments around me. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, financial reorganization, and bone-deep emotional exhaustion. Edward Reynolds moved with impressive efficiency, securing my assets within a properly structured revocable trust. The business property was transferred into the trust's ownership, and Nexus Tech was informed that future rent payments would go directly to the trust's accounts, managed solely by me, with Edward as the successor trustee. Michael attempted to contact me multiple times, calls, texts, even a tear-stained letter pushed under my door, professing that everything he'd done was for my own protection. I read his messages but didn't respond, following Edward's advice to maintain distance until our legal position was fully secured. Helen came by almost daily, bringing food I barely tasted and sitting with me through evenings when the silence of the house threatened to suffocate me. "You're doing the right thing," she assured me repeatedly. "Standing up for yourself isn't easy, especially when it's family you're standing up to." 17 days after the confrontation at the notary's office, Edward called with news. "Patricia, we've completed the financial audit. In addition to the $50,000 in diverted rent payments, we found approximately $28,000 missing from your joint checking account. Transfers to an account at Citizens Bank that appears to be controlled by Michael or possibly Sandra. The amount shouldn't have shocked me after everything else, but somehow it did." "Almost $80,000, I said numbly. "Yes, and I've received a call from Gerald Foster. He's an attorney representing Michael. He's requesting a meeting to discuss, in his words, a family resolution that serves everyone's interests. What does that mean? Edward's voice held a note of grim satisfaction. It means Michael has realized the serious legal jeopardy he's in and wants to negotiate before we involve the authorities. Do you think we should meet? That depends entirely on what you want. Patricia, if you're inclined toward option 3, a private resolution with full restitution, then yes. If you're leaning toward criminal charges, then no. We proceed directly to the DA's office. The question I'd been wrestling with for 2 weeks hung heavy in the air. What did I want? Justice. Certainly. My money returned, absolutely. But my son in prison? The family irreparably shattered? My grandchildren growing up with their father branded a felon? I want to hear what he has to say, I decided finally. But I won't be manipulated again. 2 days later, I sat in Edward's conference room. Helen at my side, facing Michael and his attorney, Gerald Foster, a smooth-talking man in his 50s with an expensive suit and a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Michael looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, his normally impeccable appearance rumpled and strained. When I entered the room, he half rose from his chair, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. But Foster placed a restraining hand on his arm, and he sank back down. Edward opened the proceedings with clinical precision. We're here to discuss the fraudulent appropriation of approximately $78,500 from Patricia Harrison by her son, Michael Harrison, through the creation of a fictitious business entity and direct theft from joint accounts. We've prepared documentation of these transactions, which I've provided to Mr. Foster. Before we decide whether to proceed with criminal charges, we're willing to hear any proposal for restitution and resolution. Foster leaned forward, his smile widening fractionally. We appreciate that opportunity, Mr. Reynolds. My client acknowledges that there have been irregularities in his handling of certain financial matters. Irregularities? Helen interrupted, her voice sharp. Let's be clear. Your client committed fraud and theft against his elderly mother. Those aren't irregularities. They're felonies. Foster's smile tightened. As I was saying, my client recognizes that his actions were inappropriate, regardless of his intentions. He's prepared to make full restitution of the amounts in question, plus an additional 20% as compensation for the distress caused. And Harrison Holdings? Edward asked. The LLC will be dissolved immediately, with all documentation and control returned to Mrs. Harrison. I studied Michael throughout this exchange. He sat with his eyes downcast, occasionally nodding but not speaking. This wasn't the confident, controlling son who'd tried to trick me into signing away my home. This was a man who'd been caught and was desperately trying to avoid the consequences. That's not enough, I said, surprising everyone, including myself. I want a full accounting of everything, every account, every transaction, every document signed in my name or regarding my property. I want written acknowledgement of what was done, not just restitution. Michael looked up then, meeting my eyes for the first time. Mom, Foster cut him off with a sharp gesture. My client is willing to provide full documentation of all financial activities related to Mrs. Harrison's assets. And I want to know why, I continued, ignoring Foster and speaking directly to my son. Not through lawyers, not through carefully worded documents. I want you to tell me to my face why you did this. Mrs. Harrison, Foster began, this meeting is to establish terms for financial resolution, not for... It's all right, Gerald, Michael interrupted, his voice rough. I owe her that much. At least. He took a deep breath. Mom, I don't have a good explanation. Not one that makes it right. After Dad died, you were so lost, so broken, and I convinced myself that taking control was protecting you. But then what? I prompted when he faltered. He swallowed hard. Then the business ran into trouble. The Marcus project fell through, and we lost almost $200,000. Sandra's father had some investment opportunities that could have made it back quickly, but we needed capital. It was supposed to be temporary, just borrowing against your assets until our investments paid off. Then everything would be returned with no one the wiser. You'd never even know. Except the investments didn't pay off, I guessed, the pieces finally falling into place. Michael shook his head miserably. They tanked. We lost everything we put in, and then we were in too deep. Sandra's dad suggested the property transfer as a way to secure assets before I discovered the theft, I finished for him. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. The room fell silent. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, loved, trusted, and felt grief deeper than even Richard's death had brought. This betrayal cut to the core of everything I believed about family, about the values I thought we shared. Here are my terms, I said finally, looking at Edward rather than Michael. Full restitution of all misappropriated funds, plus 50% as compensation. Dissolution of Harrison Holdings with all documentation surrendered. A legally binding agreement that Michael will have no access to my financial affairs in any capacity for the remainder of my life. And I paused, the hardest part catching in my throat. A minimum of 1 year with no contact between us. Michael's head jerked up. Mom, no. 1 year, I repeated firmly, during which you will seek therapy to understand why you thought it was acceptable to steal from your mother and attempt to render her homeless. After that year, if your therapist provides documentation of your progress and you demonstrate genuine remorse, we can discuss rebuilding some form of relationship. And the grandchildren? He asked, his voice breaking. They love you. They didn't do anything wrong. The thought of not seeing Emma and Jacob for a year sent a fresh wave of pain through me. But I held firm. Sandra can bring them for visits once a month, but you will not accompany them, and she will respect that this is my home and I am of sound mind. If I hear one suggestion otherwise, the visits stop. Foster leaned toward Michael, murmuring something, but Michael waved him off. I accept, he said, looking directly at me. All of it. I'll sign whatever documents Mr. Reynolds prepares. Then I won't press criminal charges, I said, the words both a relief and a sorrow. As the lawyers discussed the specifics of the agreement, Michael and I sat in silence, the gulf between us now formalized in legal terms and monetary values. When the meeting concluded, he tried once more to speak to me privately, but I shook my head. Not now, Michael. Not for a long time. You've broken something that can't be repaired with words. The pain in his eyes was real, I knew that. But so was the calculation that had led him to steal from me, to try to take my home, to paint me as incompetent to serve his own ends. Whatever genuine regret he felt now couldn't erase the betrayal. As I walked out of Edward's office into the bright autumn sunshine, I felt the weight of grief, but also something unexpected, strength. I had faced the worst betrayal imaginable and stood my ground. I had protected myself when the person I trusted most had become my greatest threat. Richard would have been proud. 6 months later, I sat on my back patio, enjoying the first truly warm day of spring. The garden was coming alive, daffodils nodding in the breeze, the cherry tree Richard had planted for our 30th anniversary, heavy with pink blossoms. Helen sat across from me, both of us nursing glasses of iced tea. The business property sold, I told her, still slightly amazed at the figure. $300,000 over asking price. The market's gone crazy. What will you do with the proceeds? Helen asked. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. Some of it goes into a proper college fund for Emma and Jacob. The rest, I'm thinking of traveling. Richard and I always talked about seeing Europe after we retired, but then he got sick and... I shrugged. Maybe it's time. It's definitely time, Helen agreed. And you'll go alone, or... She raised an eyebrow suggestively. I laughed, thinking of the retired history professor I'd met in my grief support group, whose dinner invitations I'd finally accepted last month. Maybe not alone. We'll see. We fell into comfortable silence, watching a pair of cardinals flit through the cherry blossoms. After a while, Helen asked the question I knew had been on her mind. Have you heard from Michael? His monthly reports come through, Edward. He's completed 6 months of therapy, made full restitution as agreed, and according to his therapist, is making significant progress in understanding the patterns of entitlement and rationalization that led to his actions. And how do you feel about that? I considered the question carefully. The pain of Michael's betrayal had dulled over the months, transformed from an acute, stabbing wound to a persistent ache. I'm glad he's getting help. I hope it's genuine, but I'm not ready to let him back into my life. Not yet. Do you think you ever will be? Honestly, I don't know. I set my glass down, watching the condensation trail down its side. He's still my son. I still love him, but I don't trust him, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Maybe we'll find some new way to relate to each other eventually. Something limited, cautious. Helen nodded, understanding. And in the meantime, I'm living my life. On my terms. I gestured to the house behind us. My house, securely in my trust, mine to live in for as long as I chose. I've learned that family isn't always what we thought, but that doesn't mean we're alone. You've been more family to me these past months than my own son. Well, Helen said with a smile, chosen family often is. Later that evening, after Helen had gone, I sat in Richard's office, my office now, redecorated with a lighter touch, but still housing his collection of nautical maps and the worn leather chair he'd loved. On the desk sat a framed photo of us on our last anniversary, his face gaunt from the cancer, but his eyes still bright with love. You'd be disappointed in him, I said to the photo, a habit I'd developed in the quiet evenings, but I think you'd be proud of me. From the next room came the gentle chime of my phone, a text from Sandra, sending pictures of Emma's school play and Jacob's soccer game. Despite everything, these monthly updates were a lifeline, a reminder that not all family connections had been severed. I scrolled through the photos, smiling at my grandchildren's faces. The last image made me pause. Michael in the background of Jacob's soccer photo, watching from the sidelines. He looked thinner, his expression more subdued than the confident. Controlling son I'd confronted 6 months ago. Humbled, perhaps. Changed, possibly. Time would tell if that change was deep enough, true enough to rebuild even a fragment of what had been broken. But whatever happened with Michael, I had discovered something valuable in this painful journey, my own resilience. At 65, I had faced betrayal, fought for what was mine, and emerged not just surviving, but beginning to thrive again. I sent Sandra a brief thank you for the photos, then set the phone aside and turned back to the financial documents I'd been reviewing. Not with confusion or uncertainty, but with the confidence of a woman who had run a successful business for decades and was fully capable of managing her own affairs. Outside, twilight was settling over the garden Richard had loved, that I now tended alone. Tomorrow, I would plant the new rose bushes I'd selected, a variety called New Dawn. It seemed appropriate. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.